Hello. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for coming to the Oldie Literary Lunch. My name is Harry Mount, editor of the greatest magazine in the universe, the Oldie. We are only here thanks to the wonderful Kirker Holidays, who offer fantastic cultural tours. I'm here standing in the footsteps of the late, great Barry Cryer, who used to do this job much better than I do. But we also remember a great favourite of the oldies, the late, great Dame Jilly Cooper, who sadly died yesterday. She was an absolutely fantastic friend to the oldie. Whenever she wrote yet another brilliant article for us, she would send me a thank you letter when it should have been the other way round. When I interviewed her a few years ago, she talked here about her last book, Tackle, about footballers. It's very hard to interview her because she kept on asking me questions, and she did, it's true, talk a lot about sex. We spent most of the interview at her request talking about what was the bonus hole. And she eventually worked out that it was something to do with golf, other than something else. But she also loved Dear Barry, and she had a favourite Barry Cryer joke, which is a familiar one, but it is one of the greats, and it's Barry Cryer's greatest joke about sex, which is about a young lady says to an old man, "Oh, let's go upstairs and have sex." And he says, "I can't do both." We've got three terrific speakers today. The first speaker, Frances Wilson, is an extremely distinguished literary biographer, but her most important job is as the Oldies TV reviewer. But she has written much celebrated literary biographies which have won many prizes. She's written biographies of Dorothy Wordsworth, Thomas de Quincey, D.H. Lawrence, and wrote a prize-winning book about the Titanic. And her latest book is Electric Spark, the Enigma of Muriel Spark, which is shortlisted for the Baillie Gifford Prize in a month's time. So, ladies and gentlemen, Frances Wilson.
Thank you, Harry. Can you all hear me? Am I too close to the mic?
No, close.
Okay. Right. So, Muriel Spark had superpowers. Even as a child, she was aware of what she called a definite something beyond myself, an access to knowledge I couldn't possibly have gained through normal channels, including what she called a sixth literary sense, which was available only to a few writers and critics, herself included. She suffered, I believe, from foresight, and she called herself in her second novel, she wrote 22 novels, in her second novel, which is called Robinson, she described herself as Muriel the Marvel with the X-ray eyes. Now, most novelists rework their past experiences in their books, but Muriel's novels describe her future experience. Nothing that happened to Muriel Spark hadn't been written about her in a book first. And this is what I discovered when I was writing Electric Spark. And it was a very, very disturbing discovery, I can tell you. For example, Muriel Spark's first book was a life of Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein. So she began her writing life as a biographer before she became a novelist. And in her biography of Mary Shelley, she described Mary Shelley's being blackmailed over a cache of love letters that she'd written to a man. Now, 20 years later, exactly the same thing happened to Spark. She was blackmailed over a cache of love letters. After Spark described a couple being killed by lightning, she was also struck by lightning. Her first novel was called The Comforters, published in 1957 just after she converted to Catholicism. And the novel was about a young female novelist who converts to Catholicism and then has a breakdown during which she believes that she's been written about as a character in a biography. She then, 40 years later, commissioned a biography of herself by her first biographer, Martin Stannard, and found that she was being written about as a character in a biography, and she nearly lost her mind with distress. Her friend, the Australian novelist Shirley Hazzard, said about her, "Somehow things happened, odd things, when Muriel was around." Evelyn Waugh told his children to pray for her because she was a saint, and her own prayers always worked. And the critic, Frank Kermode, said that Muriel Spark had the evil eye. Bernard Levin said that had she lived in an earlier century, she would doubtless have been burnt at the stake as the witch that she was. Now, I don't think any of these people are exaggerating. Spark lived in a dimension that she called time-space, as opposed to Einstein's space-time. And we can see this recreated in her novels, where if anyone's had the pleasure, and it's an immense pleasure, of reading a Muriel Spark novel, you'll see that she uses the rhetorical trope of prolepsis, where she describes what's going to happen at the end of the book. So, for example, in one of her stories, she says, "He looked as if he would murder me, and he did." She often described ghosts coming back to get revenge on the men who had murdered them. In another of her novels, called The Driver's Seat, she describes a woman, an unknown woman, traveling to an unknown destination in order to find a man who would murder her. And she bludgeons this man into murdering her. He doesn't want to do it, but she makes him murder her. And when he tries to rape her, she says, no, rape me after I'm dead, not now. So there's something kind of absolutely chilling about Muriel Spark. And she says on the first page of the novel, The Driver's Seat, she says, Lisa, this is the woman's name, Lisa will be found tomorrow morning dead from multiple stab wounds, her wrists bound with a silk scarf and her ankles bound with a man's necktie in the grounds of an empty villa in the park of a foreign city to which she is travelling on a flight now boarding gate 14. Now, I see The Driver's Seat as really an anticipation of what happened when Muriel Spark invited her first biographer into her life. She effectively just chose randomly a man who would murder her. And that's what happened. When she met Martin Stannard, she said to him, "Treat me as though I were dead." And had he read more of Muriel Spark's short stories, he'd know that the dead are never dead in a Muriel Spark novel. They're always there to avenge their deaths on their murderers. And the fight between Spark and Martin Stannard went on until she died, and his book finally got published. So it was in the pipeline for 17 years. She commissioned it, then tried to stop him from publishing it. She felt as if he was blackmailing her when she had invited him into her life. and it was finally published 3 years after she died. Now, Spark's life, I discovered, is riddled with strange coincidences. Her first novel, as I said, The Comforters, about the heroine's breakdown, was written and published at exactly the same time as Evelyn Waugh's last comic novel, The Ordeal of Gilbert Pinfold, which is exactly the same plot. As you know, it's about a man who suffers a breakdown on a cruise brought on by mixing his medication with alcohol, which is exactly what Spark's breakdown was brought on by as well. Now, these two novels appeared at the same time. Evelyn Waugh, they're both Catholic converts. Evelyn Waugh was very sanguine about the coincidence, and he said, well, as long as people don't think I wrote the Comforters, but he was obviously slightly worried that people would think he wrote the Comforters. And I think that Muriel Spark was actually quite disturbed by the coincidence, because it was quite disturbing. They both of them assumed it was God's plot. Muriel Spark converted to Catholicism so that she could live inside God's plot, because she thought, of course, God sees the end as well as me. I mean, he knows exactly where my story's going. So I feel safe inside his plot. So she thought, well, if this is God's plot, that Evelyn Waugh and I write the same book about the same experience, published at the same time, and people think we wrote the other's book, so be it. Now, when I was writing about Muriel Spark, I found myself entering time, space too, and I can tell you it wasn't a very comfortable experience. Spark described herself as a magnet for the experiences she needed when she was writing a novel, and I found that I was a magnet for the experiences I needed when I was writing Electric Spark, that almost everything I wanted to happen sort of happened. So I'd wake up one morning thinking, I just have to get Muriel Spark's family tree sorted out, and I would get an email that day from someone in Canada saying, I'm wondering if you need Muriel Spark's family tree sorted out, because I happen to be an expert on the Spark family tree. And I'd wake up thinking, I need to work out what happened between Spark and her son, Robin, because they were estranged. And I get a letter from someone saying, just in case you're interested in Spark's relationship with her son, Robin, I was a good friend of his, and I'd love to talk to you about it. And this went on throughout the writing of the book. I felt as though I were caught in her force field. Normally, when I write a literary biography, I feel as if I try as hard as I can to inhabit the heads of the people I write about, but with Spark it was the other way round. I felt that she was inhabiting my head, and at times I felt as if I was actually possessed by her. Her voice was so clear in my mind, and she described writing her novels as a process of tuning into voices in the air. She said she just sat down, held a pen, and just waited to see what fell on the page, and that's effectively what happened when I wrote this book. I wrote it in 4 months, and it normally takes me 4 years to write a book. And my husband said it was like watching someone in a trance state. And I was carrying an awful lot of material in my head, but I didn't know how, I didn't really know where the writing was coming from. I became completely obsessed with her and with her extraordinary story. I had very strange experiences as well. I mean, as if that wasn't strange enough, like when Spark described in a letter I was reading that she'd had to have a tooth removed. And I felt, oh, God, that must have been awful. I then the next week went to the dentist and he said, I think you need a tooth removed. And so the things that happened to her body tended to happen to my body. When she went through a kind of a sort of paranoid attack in her middle years, and I found myself also getting very paranoid. I found myself, thank you, Harry, when she wrote about being burgled, I was also burgled. I mean, it was really, really strange. I've got 1 minute left, so what will I end with? I'm going to end with saying I am a very different person as a result of my experience with Muriel Spark. I'm a much less sceptical person than I am, and I'm much less ironic than I used to be, and I'm much less judgmental than I used to be, and I'm a lot more frightened than I used to be. I feel as if I've been to some really weird places. I believe in things now that I didn't believe in before. You could say I'm a lot more open-minded. Hilary Mantel, who is, I think, the writer who's imbibed most of Muriel Spark's mischief, said, for some people, being dead is only a relative condition. They reek more than the living do. And Spark, who I think is the necromancer of the modern novel, was one of those people. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Francis, and I do hope you win next month. Our next speaker, Jeremy Hunt, knows better than anyone else, possibly in the world, what Rachel Reeves faces next month at her budget. Rachel's got a mere, I think, 30 or 4 billion pound deficit. Jeremy had, I think, 72 billion pound deficit when he took on being Chancellor of the Exchequer after Kwasi Kwarteng's disastrous mini-budget. And he's written an extremely enjoyable, very optimistic book, Can We Be Great Again? Why a Dangerous World Needs Britain. Ladies and gentlemen, former Foreign Secretary and Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you very much indeed, Harry. And one of the things that Rachel Reeves certainly does not have time to do at the moment is write a book. And I have to say that it has been enormously pleasurable to spend time writing. And when you write, you discover lots of things about yourself that you didn't know. I thought I was the first MP in my family. And I discovered that my great-grandfather was a Liberal MP, so I'm not totally out of sorts in this club. And my great-great-great-grandfather's nephew was not just an MP, but he was called George Ward Hunt. He was also, for a year, Chancellor. And quite an interesting Chancellor, because he was Disraeli's Chancellor, and he only delivered one budget, and he arrived at the House of Commons, and he'd forgotten his speech. And so he had to go back to number 11 to get his speech, and the members of the House of Commons were very cross about this, and maybe because of that, after the general election that happened later that year, he wasn't reappointed as Chancellor. And his successor, before he went to do his budget, stood in front of the door of number 11 and held up a red box, shaking it to say, "This has got a speech in it." And that is how the famous tradition started. So I didn't know that I had that connection. But I wrote this book because I think it's time we cheered up as a country. I think there is far too much doom and gloom. And I had the great privilege of being this country's diplomat-in-chief as Foreign Secretary. And when you become Foreign Secretary, it's not quite in the way that Francis describes it. It's a sort of out-of-body experience, though, because you get shown up. I'll never forget it. It was a Monday evening in July 2018. You're shown up to your office, and it is the grandest office in Whitehall. Absolutely. It's probably the size of this room, with beautiful oak panels and books, and your desk is right in the corner. And you think, and it's about 3 times bigger than the Prime Minister's office. And you really do think, bloody hell, is this my office? And then you think, and I think every Foreign Secretary, I'm sure it was the same for Yvette Cooper 3 weeks ago when she took over, you all have the same thought. Is this just an imperial delusion? Are we kidding ourselves? And then you give all these speeches saying what an important country we are. And I thought, when I leave, I'm going to write a book to get to the bottom of this. And it's called Can We Be Great Again, which is a slightly MAGA-like title, but I don't think Donald Trump should have a monopoly on the word great. And my definition of a great country is a country that can shape the world as well as be shaped by it. And I took in the book the 7 or 8 largest, most serious issues the world faces, from security in Europe to the future of democracy, the migration crisis, climate change, human rights. And I looked at them and I said, what do the experts say about Britain's influence in tackling these global problems? And without exception, they said that out of 193 countries in the United Nations, we are always in the top 10 most influential, often in the top 5. And we are the 5th least corrupt country in the G20, the 4th highest level of media freedom, the 3rd best at tackling climate change, the 2nd most generous when it comes to giving to charity. We have in Europe the top military, the top universities, the top tech sector, more hard power, more soft power than anyone else in Europe. And this is not a book that's saying we're better than other countries. I would say exactly the same thing to an audience of French or Aussies or Americans or Germans. It's saying the world is so dangerous at the moment that the worst thing we can do is to underestimate our own influence. We should be rolling up our sleeves and trying to solve the big problems that we face. And it is for that reason it is an optimistic book. And the book opens with one of my favorite sayings by the founder of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, who says, "If you are just realistic, you become pedestrian and you will fail. Therefore, you must find a way to soar above the reality and say, this is also possible." Now, in the book, there are lots of stories. And by the way, all the profits go to my local hospital, so it's all going to a good cause, but including the worst moment of my entire life, when I called my Chinese wife Japanese. And you will have to read the book to find out exactly how that rather unfortunate thing happened. But I thought I would just leave you with the story of the first time that I met Donald Trump. And so I was appointed on that Monday evening in July 2018. On Wednesday, I went to the NATO summit in Brussels. This is the famous NATO summit at which Donald Trump nearly pulled America out of NATO. And, I've been in the job 2 days, and I can't say I knew a great deal about foreign policy, but ask me about hospitals. I've been health secretary for 6 years. I could tell you anything, but I went to a meeting on the civil war in Syria that was happening at the time, and I read my brief, and the Canadian foreign minister said that if Assad won the civil war, we should worry about these brave humanitarian fighters called the White Helmets that we were supporting, rescue people from buildings that Assad had bombed, and he was, likely to kill them if he won. Anyway, I didn't contribute to the meeting very much because I didn't really know what I was talking about. Then on the Friday, came back from the NATO summit, and I had to go to Chequers to meet Donald Trump for a bilateral with Theresa May. And there were about 8 people in the meeting. And I have to say, I had a little bit of imposter syndrome. I thought, what on earth am I going to say? I've literally been doing this job 4 days. And it's, President Trump and Theresa May. And I thought, I know. I love Theresa May dearly. But despite her tremendous sense of public service, she's not the world's best at small talk. So I thought if there are any awkward moments, her diplomat-in-chief will step in. And so we had a briefing on the Middle East from C, the head of MI6. And then the briefing finished. And Donald Trump, who was on best behavior, because he was a bit embarrassed the night before he'd done an interview with The Sun, at which he'd said that Boris would make a great prime minister. So he was feeling a bit embarrassed about that. So he was very charming and heard this briefing, and he said, "That's really interesting. So what are we going to do about it?" And then we had a silence from Theresa May. And I thought, maybe this is my moment. What do I say? And I couldn't think of anything. So I said nothing. And then a few moments later, we had another Theresa May silence. And finally, when it came to the third Theresa May silence, I said, "Mr. President, if Assad wins the civil war, we need to think about what's going to happen to the White Helmets." And he looked up at me and he said, "Are they good guys or bad guys?" And I said, "Mr. President, they're good guys." But then I had a problem because I had come to the end of the runway. I knew absolutely nothing more, at which point our ambassador to Washington, Sir Kim Darroch, did what all good ambassadors do. He passed me a note. And the note said that the issue was that the White Helmets could only be evacuated over the border with Israel, and Israel wouldn't allow any Syrians over the border. So I said, "The issue is, Mr. President, the White Helmets can only be evacuated over the border with Israel, ... And he thought for a moment and he said, "Well, if they're good guys, we should get them out." And John Bolton, who was sitting next to him, said, "I'll square off the Israelis." And after lunch, Bolton came up to me and said, "I've squared off the Israelis." And 2 weeks later, 98 White Helmets, and their families, 411 Syrians in total, were evacuated across the border. And the proudest possession I have from my time as Foreign Secretary is not a glamorous sword from the Sultan of Oman, it is a white builder's helmet, all thanks to Theresa May's silences. So it's all in the book, and I hope you enjoy it if you buy it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. Our next speaker comes from Britain's greatest broadcasting dynasty, Jonathan Dimbleby. You'll remember him from his famous 1994 interview with the then Prince Charles. He presented Any Questions for 32 years, from 1987 to 2019. He's got 2 books out at the moment. One is a reissue with a new introduction of his 1979 book on the Palestinians, coming out on Friday, but he's here today to talk about his new book, Endgame, 1944, How Stalin Won the War. Ladies and gentlemen, Jonathan Dimbleby.
Thank you very much, Harry. Don't worry, I'm not going to read it all out. It's just one thing I want to be able to take from it later. This book, of course, is about a period where Britain's greatness, which was not in doubt, was sorely put to the test, the Second World War. It's the successor to a book I wrote before, which was called Barbarossa, How Hitler Lost the War, which I argued was in 1941, not 1945, in the sense that the Germans could not possibly prevail. This book, Endgame 1944, is subtitled How Stalin Won the War, which of course is a double-edged title. It suggests that the Soviet Union played the major role in the destruction of Hitler's armies, and also through that victory that Stalin emerged as the most powerful force in Europe, with the capacity to impose on a huge proportion of that continent Soviet communist rule. And the Cold War was the direct result of that victory, is what I suggest. The essence of the book, the way I try and write books is all levels, using diaries, letters, memoirs occasionally, often to be distrusted, things that were written at the time, at all levels, by those who were fighting the battles, by those who were commanding armies, by those politicians who were commanding countries, and the diplomatic level. In this case, the big 3 as they became known, Churchill, Stalin, and of course Roosevelt. You have to picture 1944. The Germans are being pushed back. They've been pushed back from Stalingrad. Vast armies on the battlefield, 3,000 kilometers width, from the Baltics to the Balkans, and some 6 million Soviet soldiers. They had started the war in 1941, the great patriotic war as they call it, with 6 million soldiers. They had already lost 7 million soldiers, but they were able to field 6 million. The Germans in 1941 had invaded with just over 3 million soldiers. Now they were down to 2.8 million. So there was a huge military advantage on the Soviet side. In addition, the Allies were in the war. Soviet Union was supported hugely by the ability of the Americans to supply vast numbers of trucks, supported by us as well to a lesser extent, the British. On that front, the mega battles in the winter of 1944, after this retreat had taken them into Ukraine, which they had conquered, was for Ukraine. And it was a very bitter, vicious struggle in the worst of weather imaginable. And I try to describe that through the experiences of those who were actually in those bunkers, freezing, very often freezing to the point where their limbs had to be taken off. The retreat carries on all the way up. In January, Stalingrad, Leningrad, which had been under 876 days of siege, where 1 million people had died, was liberated. I can never quite get my head around that. 1 million people dying. And this was civilians. This was not fighters inside Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, of course. The advance continues, and you reach a point of May of 1944. There had been the most important diplomatic meeting of the war so far, and actually, in my view, the most important, which took place in Tehran between the big three. And at that meeting, they decided, in effect, the fate of Eastern Europe, because it was by then certain that, in due course, the Allies were going to win. Stalin was in extraordinarily confident form. Roosevelt wanted to ingratiate himself with Stalin, because he had the view that he could, post-war, create a new world order alongside the Soviet Union. Churchill came away from that meeting reflecting, here I was. On one side, the great American buffalo. On the other, the great Russian bear. And in the middle was the little British donkey. That's to say, he was aware that our position was much weaker than it had been when we were fighting alone. In the act of D-Day, of course, the Allies played a major role. It was an extraordinary venture, the D-Day landings, and what happened after that. Very hard fought, particularly in France, and it took a very long time to liberate France, to reach Paris. 2 months, more than 2 months. At the same time, the biggest battle of the whole war was being fought on the Eastern Front. It was called Bagration, the name given to it by Stalin. And in that battle, 330,000 German troops were either killed, wounded, or captured. And the destruction of what was called Army Group Center, the main army group there, actually was the destruction of the capacity, effectively, of the Germans to fight. Only the most wild-eyed Nazi could conceivably believe that it was still possible to win the war. That victory allowed Stalin's men to get to Warsaw, which was the last terrible final act on the Eastern Front. The Warsaw Uprising, heroic and horribly ill-advised. The political debate that was going on all the way through was an increasingly alarmed Churchill about the power of the Soviet Union. Don't you know, he would say to Eden, it's all there in the documentation, don't you know they're coming across Europe like a tide? It's an evil force. Roosevelt, to the contrary, as I indicated, was cozying up the whole time because he still believed that it would be possible to rule the world with Stalin. So you reach the end of 1944 when Hitler in Berlin is with one of his key figures, who is an air advisor, and says to him, if we fail, it'll be the failure of the German people. And if we fail, we will at least go down and bring the world down with us. And they continued to fight on. And we reached 1945, and of course the end of the war. And tellingly, this is a political footnote of history, within 12 days of celebrating VE Day here in this city, the massive joy, Churchill was saying to his most senior military advisors, the Chief of General Staff, I want you to do me a paper. Is it possible for us to do a surprise attack on the Soviet armies in Eastern Germany within weeks? And they did as they were bid, and the paper was called Operation Unthinkable. And that was partly because they said it is possible to take them on, but you would need the entire American army in Europe, you would need the German armies that are left, you would need all the Commonwealth armies, and it would be a long, drawn-out war of attrition. That was a measure of Soviet strength. So the book's general conclusion is that we were impotent against Stalin in order to have a victory against the Nazis. And of course it was a very critical victory. freedom, democracy, the rule of law was salvaged in the West. In the East, we know what happened, and the original ostensible casus belli, why we declared war on September the 3rd, 1939, Poland was in the grip of the Soviet Union. I'm going to just finish by reading one extract from this book, because I haven't really dwelt here, but it does in the book, I'm afraid, on the total horror of war, the awfulness. The Eastern Front, it was remarkably civilized in comparison on the Western Front with the horrors perpetrated, and not only the Holocaust, which was the first of the death camps was exposed by the Soviet Union in July, August of 1944, which was called Mayanek outside Lublin, and which was 6 months before they liberated Auschwitz, and there was total horror at that. But in that same advance I was talking about eastwards, when they went dramatic speed towards Warsaw and then on, they unearthed 1 million graves, Russian graves, everywhere. The killing, the murderous barbarism of that front is beyond imagination. It created, however, the world in which we, as in my case, just about born. I want to read this. It's from a poet, 23-year-old aspiring poet, and his name was Willie Rees. He was an ordinary foot soldier in the German army, and he had seen the terrible destruction wrought by his own armies as they retreated westward to certain defeat. And he was horrified by everything he saw: refugees in every direction, bridges burning, towns burning, woods burning, vehicles burning. And he wrote a poem about this depredation. And he wrote this: "We are at war because we're soldiers. I've burned all the cities, strangled all the women, brained all the children, plundered all the land. I have shot 1 million enemies, laid waste the fields, destroyed the churches, ravaged the souls of the inhabitants, spilled the blood and tears of all the mothers. I did it, all me. I did nothing, but I was a soldier." And that's stuck with me ever since I first unearthed it. It's not a celebratory way to end a delicious lunch with lovely people, and so I half apologize for that, but hope you might buy the book, because I think I like to think, importantly, understanding what happened on the Eastern Front, which brought us victory. We would not have had victory without the Russians. I fear in the end that even without the West, in the end, the Soviet Union would have beaten the Germans with all sorts of consequences which one quails to think of. However, I hope you'll think it's useful, and that you may therefore take the opportunity to buy it. Thank you for our lunch.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and thank you so much to all three of our terrific speakers who will be signing their books after lunch, not where they were before lunch, but just outside these double doors. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Kirker Holidays, again, who very kindly have given a fantastic magnum of champagne to our winner. If you could hold up your hands so Patrick from Kirker can give it to you. It's Robin Privet from Surrey. Robin, are you in the room? Yes. Well done, sir. Patrick. Anyway, so the riders will be outside the front of those doors, and thank you all so much for coming to the Oldie Literary Lunch. Thank you.